Precious Blood a lot last year while I was here in Kansas City, and Father Keith Branson, I credit you for keeping me sane last year as a Jesuit volunteer. He was my spiritual director last year, and so being here is kind of like surreal just because this is kind of where it all started for me. And I say that as a former Jesuit volunteer who had a really good experience, but I had no idea that I would be here with Precious Blood almost a year later of taking on the challenge. And Tim said that he knew that I decided to do this. Well, it really was Tim convincing me to do this. So, yeah, I kind of want to start off with this quote from this book that I read the other day. And I've read this book many times, but this quote really stood out to me because it's been kind of like the theme of my whole year. So as a Jesuit volunteer, I read a lot of Jesuit stuff. And one of my favorite Jesuits is Father Greg Boyle, who runs Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. And in his second book, Barking to the Choir, in his chapter called The Good Guy, it talks about judgment. And he says if we could simply drop the burden of our own judgments, we could see with clarity, and then compassion would be possible. And he continues to go on that, and like he says moral outrage, but that's really our own judgments, right? He says moral outrage is the opposite of God. It only divides and separates what God wants for us, which is to be united in kinship. Moral outrage doesn't lead us to solutions, it keeps us from them. It keeps us from moving forward toward a fuller, more compassionate response to members of our community who belong to us, no matter what they've done. Since the day I got to PBMR, I've been confronted with my own judgments. Being a former Jesuit volunteer, working with migrant farm workers and their families, I felt like I had a good grasp of what being a volunteer meant, what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to do this and that. I read this, and I was part of the Office of Social Justice at my school and my university, and I decided to do a year of service, right? And I was working with migrant farm workers and their families, and for that placement, I'm not saying it was easier, but it kind of was, in that from my own background as a Mexican American and descendant of immigrants, I have family members who are currently still migrant farm workers, and many of my family before me were migrant farm workers, right? I speak Spanish. I grew up in Texas. My dad and most of my family's from the Rio Grande Valley. I sort of had that in to the community, right? And yeah, I had the in. I understood a lot. I had done a lot of migration and immigration law stuff. My original plan was to go to law school, but obviously that didn't happen. And it's been very interesting going from that place, feeling like I had an in, but still learned the hardships of life, going to very urban Chicago, to a place where I absolutely knew nothing about the situations that were happening there, the poverty that was happening there, the violence that was happening there. Like, you could only read so many books that tell you all this stuff is happening. But it's something special, but also something very jarring to go and see it for yourself. And when I first got there, October 1st, I started on October 1st. I started a little bit later than Stephen. I have been confronted with my judgments of those who have been incarcerated, of my own prejudices as not an African American in the community. I have been confronted by my family and many of my friends, like, why are you working with those people who have done the worst of the worst or have made bad choices? Many of the choices don't have to have anything to do with them, but of the environments and the situations that they were born in. And so, it's been going from being a Jesuit volunteer where materially was very challenging. Like, my stipend was a lot less as a Jesuit volunteer. I lived in a mice-infested house, and Kansas City. We had, community life was very different because I lived with 4 other Jesuit volunteers. We all worked at different places, one of them being at Casey Care Health Center, and at Legal Aid of Western Missouri, where we've had volunteers as Precious Blood volunteers in the past. Materially, my life as a JV was very different compared to this, but because my stipend in Precious Blood has been a little bit higher, I live with the sisters, you know, we have a very stable place in a community, but internally and spiritually has been 10 times harder, 10 times more than I ever expected it to be, just because I had those preconceived notions. Oh, I've done this before, like, this is my 2nd year, I'll be fine. It's been very challenging, but also one of the best experiences of my life. When I talk about, you know, like friends and family who ask me, like, why do you work with those people? I have conversations with Father Denny Kinderman, love him, and Father Dave Kelly. And I remember having a conversation with Father Denny. I'm just like, how do I answer people who ask me what I do and like why I do it? And Father Denny, if those of you who know Father Denny, he can be kind of blunt, but really funny. And he told me, he was like, Lina, just tell them it's what God told you to freaking do. But he didn't say freaking. And I'm just like, you're right? Like, he didn't, but he was right though, you know? It's like, when you work with people who are deemed to be disposable in society because of many things that are out of their control, it changes a lot within you. And it really is a call from God to like recognize that. It truly is a call to recognize the dignity of each person. And even Father Kelly last night at the gala said, you know, like, even though we as who we are as middle-class privileged people work with young people who are on the margins, we can never pretend like we understand what they're going through, which is true. I could never say that I grew up in any of what our young people are going through. But I can say, and I don't want any of them to doubt how much we love them at PBMR. Because Father Kelly loves them, Father Denny loves them, everybody on staff loves them, and that's what we want to create, is a place of love, a place of nurturing, a place where people are valid despite what society and what our laws say they are. Just last week, I've been thinking about this a lot, just because it happened last Friday. One of our big charisms at PBMR is hospitality. We like to embrace radical hospitality. And that can mean a lot of different things, from food to case management to whatever. And we have like a desk, you know, where we sit at the front. It's where like we open doors and things. There's a computer that we can open the doors with. And I like to sit there. A lot of people like frown upon sitting at that desk just because, you know, everybody gets busy. They have their own things to do. But I actually like sitting out there because it allows me to greet people and talk to people and see where they're at. And so I sit out there, and a young man, his name is Kenyon, who I've known since I got there, comes up, and he was, you know, just like, I'll sit with you while you're on your hospitality duty. And I'm like, all right. We start talking about all these different things, and he tells me that he was just released. He's 21 years old, and he was just released from being in juvenile life. So once he turned 21, he was able to be released, but he was sentenced to juvenile life and juvenile detention from the age of 16 until he was 21. And, you know, he's experienced a lot of trauma, a lot of violence. One of his good friends was killed in December that we had in PBMR. Was, you know, he's seen a lot of people die, a lot of people get shot. And, you know, he's a young black man. He understands what it's like to be a young black man in an urban environment, constantly traumatized by police and mass incarceration and, you know, just all kinds of stuff. And he asked me this question. He was like, Lina, you aren't afraid to be around us? Like people like us? And I said, no. And he's just like, that's why we like you. But if you really think about it, that question is jarring though, just because it's like, he was conditioned to think that people like me are conditioned to be afraid of people like him. when really we all belong to each other, like Father Greg said. Everybody in our community belongs to one another, despite the separations that we see in our life. And so I've been thinking about it a lot. I'm just like, how can we, as reconciling presence, as Precious Blood members, continue to break down those barriers of fear? That's been a huge part of my experience at PBMR. And just by myself, I've had to deconstruct those walls that, I've held up that I didn't even realize. So yeah, that has been a lot of my experience. I want to thank you for all of your support, for Father Keith, Father Gary, Father Dick, who I lived with last year, especially for Tim, though, too, because Tim, like I said, he convinced me, but he did it in a very loving way, and he's been so supportive of me and Stephen. I'm pretty sure Stephen can say the same, because we talk all the time. Stephen and I are very close, and he wanted me to tell all of you hi, so even though he couldn't be here. So yeah, I want to thank all of you for your support and for your love and for your prayers. They're very much needed, and thank you.